What if the most dangerous weapon in a family wasn't anger, or jealousy, or even hatred? What if it was silence? Because sometimes silence isn't peace. Sometimes silence is bought. And sometimes silence comes with a price so high that the person paid to keep quiet becomes disposable. Let me ask you something right now, before we go any further. If someone wired you $50 million, no questions asked, no contracts signed in public, no witnesses invited into the room, would you really believe it was a gift? Or would you wonder what they were so desperate to keep buried? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. That question sits at the heart of this story. A story about a powerful family that looked untouchable from the outside. A story about inheritance, loyalty, fear, and a secret agreement that was never supposed to see the light of day. And a story that, according to one voice breaking ranks, didn't just destroy trust. It may have set someone up to take the fall when everything collapsed. Because this isn't just about money. It's about what happens when money is used to control the truth. For years, the Reiner family name carried weight. Success, prestige, stability. The kind of reputation that made people assume everything behind the gates was just as polished as what appeared in public. But as you already know, the most dangerous stories rarely start with villains and victims clearly labeled. They start with tension. They start with whispered disagreements at family dinners, with side glances when inheritance is mentioned, with private conversations that never make it into the room where everyone else is smiling. And, allegedly, this one started with a lie about inheritance. According to this dramatized reconstruction, the lie wasn't small. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a miscommunication that could be brushed aside with an apology and a glass of wine. It was a claim about who would receive what, who was protected, and who, quietly, was being pushed out of the future. Now imagine discovering that lie not through paperwork, but through confrontation. Imagine one family member finally deciding they'd had enough. Enough of half-truths. Enough of vague promises. Enough of being told to wait. And imagine what happens when that confrontation doesn't end in resolution, but in panic. Because here's the part most people don't think about. When someone with power is confronted with exposure, their first instinct isn't always to explain. Sometimes, it's to contain. And according to the story you're about to hear, containment came in the form of a wire transfer so large it was impossible to ignore, and impossible to explain away as generosity. $50 million. Let that number sit with you for a moment. $50 million doesn't buy comfort. It doesn't buy forgiveness. It buys control. It buys time. It buys silence. And in this case, allegedly, it bought something far darker. Because the agreement, as it's been described, wasn't just about staying quiet. It was about loyalty under pressure. About what would happen if the family image cracked. About who would be blamed if the story escaped the walls of the estate. And about what one son was expected to do if everything went wrong. This is where the story takes a turn that makes people uncomfortable. Because according to one account, the silence pact came with an unspoken understanding. If disaster struck, someone else would be protected, and someone would take the fall. Ask yourself this. Would you recognize that kind of deal if you were standing inside it? Or would it only become clear when it was already too late? Now fast forward. A sprawling estate. A quiet Sunday night. Two people found dead inside a home that was supposed to symbolize safety, success, and permanence. And a son living just steps away in the guest house. The shock didn't stop with the discovery. It escalated. Because within hours, the narrative began to shift. Suspicion didn't point outward. It turned inward. And when authorities began asking questions, one family member reportedly said something that changed everything. A warning. A statement about a dangerous person inside the family. A name that, once spoken, couldn't be taken back. That was the moment the private fractures became public fault lines. And that's when the silence pact, the one that allegedly never existed, suddenly started to make sense. Because here's the contradiction no one could ignore. If everything was normal, why had $50 million moved so quickly, so quietly, and with no explanation? If there was nothing to hide, why was one person being urged to stay invisible? And if this was all coincidence, why did the story only begin to unravel after blood had already been spilled? But the most explosive element of this entire narrative didn't come from investigators. It didn't come from leaked documents. It didn't come from financial records. It came from inside the family, from someone who allegedly decided that silence had gone too far. A brother. Someone who, according to this dramatized account, believed the pact wasn't about protection at all, but preparation. Preparation for a fall guy. Preparation for a moment when the family would need someone to absorb the blame while others walked away untouched. That accusation changes everything. Because if it's true, then the tragedy wasn't just a crime. It was the final chapter of a deal written long before anyone realized how dangerous it was. And that brings us back to the question we started with. What if the money wasn't paid to keep someone quiet? What if it was paid to make sure they couldn't speak when it mattered most? Over the next chapters, we're going to walk through this story step by step. We're going to explore the family dynamic that made the pact possible, the inheritance dispute that lit the fuse, the confrontation that triggered panic, the wire transfer that raised silent alarms, and the warning that redirected suspicion inward. We'll examine why one brother claims the deal existed, why others deny it, and why the truth may sit somewhere far more uncomfortable than either side wants to admit. Because in stories like this, the real danger isn't what's proven. It's what everyone is afraid to say out loud. And in the next chapter, we start where every illusion begins to crack. With the family, everyone thought they knew. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. The family, everyone thought they knew. Let me start with a question that sounds simple, but isn't. How well do you really know the people closest to you? Not the version they present at holidays. Not the version they perform for friends, neighbors, or cameras. The version that shows up behind closed doors, when money is discussed, when legacies are questioned, when the future suddenly feels uncertain. Because this story doesn't begin with violence. It begins with image. From the outside, the Reiner family looked like a finished puzzle. Wealth, stability, longevity, the kind of family people quietly envied, the kind that seemed immune to chaos. A long marriage, successful careers, adult children who appeared provided for, protected, and positioned for life. The gates were tall, the walls were thick, and the assumption was simple. Nothing bad happens here. But let me ask you this. When a family has that much to lose, do you think the pressure is lighter or heavier? Because behind polished estates and carefully curated reputations, pressure doesn't disappear. It concentrates, it hardens, and sometimes it turns inward. According to this dramatized reconstruction, the Reiners didn't fall apart overnight. They cracked slowly, tiny fractures that didn't matter at first, small disagreements that were brushed off, moments of discomfort that everyone pretended not to notice. Until one subject made it impossible to keep pretending. Inheritance. Now, inheritance isn't just about money. It's about validation. It's about legacy. It's about who mattered and who didn't. And in families with enormous wealth, inheritance becomes something else entirely. A scoreboard. Who gets what? Who's trusted? Who's protected? And who is quietly being sidelined? For years, conversations about the future were allegedly vague. Promises were implied but never locked down. Reassurances were given, then softened. Expectations were set, then adjusted. Have you ever been told, "Don't worry, everything will be taken care of," without being told how? That kind of reassurance can calm you, or slowly drive you insane. Because uncertainty breeds suspicion. And suspicion, left long enough, becomes resentment. Within the family, roles were already established. One child seen as responsible, another as volatile. One trusted with access, another kept at arm's length. These labels didn't need to be spoken out loud. Everyone felt them. And the most dangerous thing about unspoken hierarchies? They feel permanent until someone challenges them. The cracks widened when whispers began circulating about changes, about promises that might not be honored, about narratives being rewritten quietly behind the scenes. And here's where things get uncomfortable. According to the story, at least one family member believed they were being lied to. Not misled, lied to. About what they would inherit. About their role in the family's future. About how disposable they really were. Think about that for a moment. If you suddenly realized that the future you were counting on had been quietly erased, wouldn't you want answers? Wouldn't you confront the people responsible? That confrontation, according to this dramatized account, was inevitable. Because you can only swallow doubt for so long before it starts to choke you. The family gatherings grew tense. Conversations became shorter. Smiles became strategic. Eye contact lingered just a second too long. Every interaction carried subtext. Who knows what? Who suspects what? And who's pretending not to notice? This is how families fracture. Not with screaming matches, but with silence thick enough to feel. And then, allegedly, someone decided they were done waiting. The confrontation wasn't planned as an explosion. It wasn't supposed to be dramatic. It was meant to be clarifying. A demand for honesty. A request for truth. But truth is dangerous when it threatens control. According to the account we're following, when inheritance lies were brought into the open, panic followed. Not denial. Panic. Because denial argues. Panic reacts. And reaction is where mistakes are made. Suddenly, conversations shifted. Damage control replaced discussion. Containment replaced explanation. And instead of transparency, something else appeared. Fear. Fear that secrets might escape. Fear that narratives might unravel. Fear that someone might talk. Let me ask you something. If you believed your entire legacy could collapse because one person decided to speak, how far would you go to keep them quiet? This is where the story takes its most unsettling turn. Because according to later claims, silence wasn't requested. It was purchased. The family everyone thought they knew didn't sit down for mediation. They didn't involve lawyers in the open. They didn't clarify misunderstandings with documentation. Instead, allegedly, a wire transfer moved quietly through financial channels. $50 million. No press release. No explanation. No celebration. Just money. And money doesn't move like that without intention. This wasn't generosity. It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't support. It was leverage. Imagine being on the receiving end of that transfer. What would you think first? Gratitude? Relief? Or dread? Because money that large doesn't just solve problems. It creates obligations. And according to the allegation, the obligation wasn't simply silence. It was loyalty under worst-case conditions. An understanding that if the family ever faced public destruction, someone else would be shielded. Someone else would be protected. And someone would be expected to absorb the consequences. If that sounds extreme, ask yourself this. Why would anyone accept money like that without written terms? Why would anyone agree to silence unless they believed speaking would destroy them? And why would a family with nothing to hide need a silence pact at all? This is the contradiction at the heart of the story. Publicly, everything looked intact. Privately, a deal may have already sealed someone's fate. And here's the detail that makes everything even more chilling. According to the narrative that would later emerge, the person receiving the money wasn't just expected to stay quiet. They were expected to be ready. Ready for a moment when things went wrong. Ready to stand alone if blame needed a home. Ready to carry a burden that no amount of money could undo. At the time, none of this was visible to the outside world. Life continued. The estate remained serene. The image held. But inside the family, trust had already died. And when trust dies, everything else follows. Because when tragedy finally struck, the groundwork had already been laid. The silence pact, real or imagined, suddenly explained things that once made no sense. Why someone stayed close but isolated. Why warnings were whispered instead of shouted. Why suspicion turned inward so quickly. And why, when authorities began asking questions, one family member reportedly pointed to danger within the family itself. That warning didn't come from nowhere. It came from years of fear, resentment, and deals that were never meant to survive daylight. So as we move forward, keep this in mind. This wasn't just a crime story. It was a slow collapse. A collapse fueled by secrecy, power, and the belief that money could control the future. In the next chapter, we go deeper into the lie that started it all. The inheritance promise that was allegedly never meant to be kept. And once you see how that lie unfolded, you'll understand why everything that followed may have been inevitable. But what came next would expose a truth no one was prepared to face, the inheritance lie. Let me ask you something uncomfortable. If someone promised you a future, not in writing, not in public, but repeatedly, privately, over years, would you trust it? Or would you start counting the moments when that promise quietly changed shape? Because this chapter isn't about money moving through accounts. It's about words. Words spoken behind closed doors. Words softened with smiles. Words that sounded reassuring until they didn't. According to this dramatized account, the inheritance story didn't unravel all at once. It drifted, slowly, almost politely. The kind of drift that's easy to dismiss at first. You're covered. Don't worry about it. Everything's already planned. Those phrases can feel like security. They can also be a trap. Inside families with significant wealth, inheritance conversations are rarely direct. They're wrapped in emotion, history, and power. Parents don't like to admit they're choosing. Children don't like to admit they're competing. So instead of clarity, you get implication. And implication is dangerous. At first, the understanding seemed clear enough. One son believed he had a defined place in the future. Not just financially, emotionally. A role, a recognition, a sense that no matter what happened, he mattered. But over time, the language allegedly changed. Promises became vague. Timelines stretched. Details disappeared. And here's the part people outside these families often miss. It's not the money that hurts first. It's the realization that someone doesn't want to commit to you. Because when inheritance is delayed indefinitely, it sends a message. Not yet. Not sure. Maybe later. And maybe later can feel like rejection dressed as patience. The son at the center of this chapter began to notice inconsistencies. Small ones. The kind that only stand out when you're already uneasy. Comments that didn't line up. Decisions made without his knowledge. Financial conversations he wasn't included in anymore. Have you ever noticed how exclusion doesn't announce itself? It just happens. One meeting you're not invited to. One document you don't see. One discussion that ends when you enter the room. At first, it's easy to blame yourself. Maybe I'm reading too much into this. Maybe I'm being paranoid. Maybe I should just trust them. But paranoia doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from patterns. And according to this reconstruction, the pattern became impossible to ignore when inheritance discussions shifted from reassurance to deflection. Questions were answered with jokes. Concerns were met with irritation. And the more clarity was requested, the less was offered. That's when suspicion took root. Not suspicion of money being lost. Suspicion of money being redirected. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. In families like this, inheritance isn't just about distribution. It's about control. Whoever controls the narrative controls the future. And if someone believes you might challenge that narrative, they may start quietly repositioning assets. Not out of cruelty. Out of fear. Fear that you'll talk. Fear that you'll demand proof. Fear that you'll disrupt the image they've built. According to the allegation, this is where the lie crystallized. The son began to believe that promises about inheritance were never meant to be fulfilled. That reassurance was being used to keep him compliant. Calm. Quiet. And the more he pressed, the more resistance he felt. That resistance wasn't explosive. It was defensive. And defensiveness is revealing. Let me ask you something. If you were being honest, would you get defensive when asked to clarify? Or would you simply explain? The shift in tone reportedly spoke volumes. What once felt like family discussions began to feel like negotiations. What once felt like care began to feel like management. And that's when the confrontation became inevitable. Because there comes a moment when ambiguity stops feeling safe. A moment when uncertainty feels more dangerous than conflict. According to this dramatized account, that moment arrived quietly. No raised voices at first. No accusations thrown across the room. Just a direct question. What exactly is the plan? It's a simple question, but it can shatter everything. Because the answer requires truth. And when truth threatens power, it often triggers panic. The response, according to the story, wasn't clarity. It was avoidance. Deflection wrapped in concern. Reassurance without substance. Promises to talk later. But later never came. And that's when frustration hardened into certainty. The son allegedly realized something chilling. The lie wasn't accidental. It was strategic. He wasn't being delayed. He was being sidelined. And sidelining doesn't happen without intention. Now, here's where the emotional stakes explode. Confronting a family member about inheritance isn't just a financial accusation. It's a moral one. It says, I don't trust you. It says, I think you're manipulating me. It says, I believe you're capable of betrayal. That kind of accusation doesn't stay contained. It changes how everyone in the room sees each other. According to this reconstruction, when the confrontation finally happened, it wasn't dramatic in the way movies portray. It was colder, sharper. Because cold confrontation leaves no room for theatrics. Just truth, or the refusal to provide it. And the refusal, allegedly, was telling. No documents were produced. No timelines were. And behind the scenes, something else was happening. something no one would admit openly. Preparations. Quiet ones. Financial ones. Because if you believe someone might expose you or disrupt your plans, the fastest way to neutralize that threat is an argument. It's incentive, which brings us to the decision that would later raise every red flag imaginable. The decision to move money. A lot of money. But before we get there, there's one more emotional layer that matters. The son wasn't just angry. He was hurt. Because realizing you've been lied to by family doesn't just damage trust. It rewrites your entire history. Every reassurance becomes suspicious. Every kind gesture feels calculated. Every past moment is re-examined through a new lens. And once that lens clicks into place, there's no going back. That's the tragedy of inheritance lies. They don't just steal futures. They poison memories. So when the wire transfer eventually happened, sudden, massive, unexplained, it didn't feel like generosity to the person receiving it. It felt like confirmation. Confirmation that the lie was real. Confirmation that silence had value. And confirmation that someone was afraid of what might happen if the truth surfaced. In the next chapter, we'll step into the night everything came to a head. The confrontation that triggered panic. The moment fear turned into action. And the conversation that allegedly convinced someone that silence wasn't optional, it was required. Because what happened next didn't just change the family dynamic. It set the stage for everything that followed. And once you hear how that confrontation unfolded, you'll understand why $50 million suddenly made terrifying sense. The night of the confrontation. Let me ask you a question before we step into this night. Have you ever walked into a conversation knowing it might permanently change how you see someone you love? Because that's not courage. That's desperation. According to this dramatized reconstruction, the confrontation didn't happen in public. It didn't happen during a family gathering or over a carefully staged dinner. It happened quietly, intentionally. Behind closed doors, where there would be no witnesses to tone, no third party to soften the edges, no one to later say, "You must have misunderstood." This was supposed to be clarity. Instead, it became ignition. The room was calm at first. Too calm. The kind of calm that feels rehearsed. Controlled. A space where everyone knows the conversation is overdue, but no one wants to be the first to break the surface. The son came prepared, not with documents, not with lawyers, not with threats, but with questions. Simple ones. Direct ones. Questions that demanded something more than reassurance. What's the plan? What exactly am I supposed to expect? Why does everything keep changing when I ask for specifics? Silence answered first. Not angry silence. Calculating silence. The kind that stretches just long enough to remind you who holds power in the room. Then came deflection. Concern without substance. Empathy without answers. Promises to revisit the conversation later. But later had already passed. That's what made this night different. The son didn't accept the pivot. He didn't back down. He didn't soften the questions to make them easier to swallow. He pushed. And pressure reveals everything. Voices didn't rise immediately. They tightened. Sentences shortened. The language shifted from familial to strategic. And then, according to the account, the truth slipped. Not fully, but enough. Enough to confirm that what he feared wasn't paranoia. It was intention. Inheritance wasn't just unclear. It was being actively controlled, redirected, managed without his consent. And here's where the emotional temperature changed. Because once the realization landed, once it became clear that promises had been used as placeholders rather than commitments, the conversation stopped being about money. It became about trust. And trust, once broken, doesn't shatter loudly. It collapses inward. The son reportedly asked a question that hung in the air like a challenge. Were you ever planning to tell me? That question isn't about information. It's about respect. And the response, according to this dramatized version, wasn't an answer. It was fear. Fear that the conversation had gone too far. Fear that the silence could no longer be maintained. Fear that the narrative, the one carefully curated for years, was now at risk. This is the moment where everything shifted. Because instead of engaging, the tone allegedly changed from defensive to urgent. Containment mode. The conversation ended abruptly. Not with resolution. Not with reassurance. But with tension thick enough to feel physical. The son left without clarity. But he left with certainty. Certainty that something was wrong. Certainty that the future he'd been promised didn't exist. Certainty that honesty had limits. and he had reached them. What he didn't know yet was that the confrontation didn't end when he walked out. It continued, behind closed doors, without him. According to the reconstruction, panic set in almost immediately. Not panic about family harmony, panic about exposure. Because once someone starts asking the right questions, the next step is obvious. They start asking other people. They start looking for proof. They start connecting dots. And that's when control becomes urgent. Here's the part people struggle to understand. Power doesn't always respond with force. Sometimes it responds with generosity. Because generosity creates obligation. And obligation creates silence. Within days, not weeks, not months, the decision was allegedly made. The son would be neutralized, not removed, not confronted again, contained. And the method chosen wasn't legal paperwork or family mediation. It was money. A transfer so large it couldn't be ignored, yet quiet enough to avoid attention. $50 million. But before the wire ever moved, there was another conversation. One far more dangerous than the first. According to the dramatized account, this second conversation wasn't framed as a negotiation. It was framed as concern. Concern for stability. Concern for stress. Concern for everyone's well-being. And buried inside that concern was a message that didn't need to be spoken explicitly. This is for your own good. Because when money enters a conversation like this, it carries subtext. It says, we can solve this quietly. We can protect everyone. We can make this go away. But it also says something else. We are afraid of what you might do next. And fear, when sensed, is intoxicating. The son reportedly recognized the shift immediately. This wasn't reconciliation. It was insurance. Insurance against him speaking. Insurance against him pushing further. Insurance against him becoming unpredictable. That realization came with a choice. Accept the money and everything it implied. Or refuse it. And escalate a conflict with people who had far more power, resources, and influence. Let me ask you something. What would you do? Because refusing doesn't just mean saying no. It means declaring war. And according to this story, the son wasn't ready for war. He was tired, emotionally drained, disillusioned. And when you're exhausted, survival instincts take over. So the money was accepted. Quietly. No celebration. No announcement. No sense of victory. Just a transaction. And transactions always come with terms, whether they're written or not. The alleged understanding wasn't delivered as a threat. It was delivered as an assumption. That discretion was expected. That loyalty was required. That if the family faced scrutiny, unity would matter more than truth. And then came the line that would later haunt everything. If anything ever goes wrong, we handle it together. Together is a comforting word. It can also be vague enough to hide intent. Because together doesn't always mean equal. Sometimes it means someone stands in front, while others stand behind. At the time, the son didn't interpret the statement as ominous. He interpreted it as conditional support, a safety net. What he didn't realize was that safety nets can be designed to catch only some people. After the transfer, the atmosphere changed. The tension eased, superficially. Conversations resumed. Smiles returned. The family image stabilized. From the outside, everything looked normal again. But something fundamental had shifted. The son was quieter, more isolated, less present. And when someone asked why, the answer was simple. He didn't want trouble. But silence has a cost. And the cost isn't just emotional. It's psychological. Because every time you choose not to speak, you reinforce the power of the people you're protecting. And over time, that power grows. Meanwhile, inside the family, something else happened. A new narrative formed. One that quietly repositioned roles. Who was reliable? Who was volatile? Who might be dangerous? Because once someone is paid for silence, their silence can later be reframed as guilt. That's the trap. And it's one of the oldest ones in existence. As months passed, the money sat untouched. Not spent. Not enjoyed. Because it wasn't freedom. It was weight. A constant reminder of the deal. A reminder that if anything surfaced, questions would be asked. And answers would be expected. From him. This is where the story darkens. Because when tragedy eventually struck, sudden, violent, incomprehensible, the groundwork had already been laid. The son wasn't just present on the property. He was already framed. Not publicly, but psychologically. The idea that he was unstable, that he was unpredictable, that he might be dangerous. Those ideas didn't come from nowhere. They receded, quietly, over time. And when authorities arrived, shock collided with something else. Relief. Not relief that harm had occurred. Relief that the narrative already existed. That suspicion had somewhere to land. And that's when the warning came. A statement from within the family pointing inward. A claim about danger. A suggestion that suspicion should begin at home. That statement didn't emerge in a vacuum. It emerged from months, maybe years, of positioning. And suddenly, the silence pact wasn't just about money anymore. It was about survival. Because if the son spoke now, if he broke silence, everything would unravel. The inheritance lie, the confrontation, the transfer, the understanding, all of it. And once those pieces were visible, the story would no longer be controllable. That's why what happened next is so important. Because when tragedy meets pre-existing fear, the response isn't rational. It's reflexive. In the next chapter, we step into the estate itself. The setting everyone thought was safe. The layout that suddenly mattered. The proximity that raised impossible questions. And the night when containment gave way to chaos. Because once you understand the environment where everything unfolded, you'll see why suspicion didn't spread evenly. It locked onto one person. And once it did, there was no turning back. But what came next would transform fear into accusation. And the silence pact into a potential death sentence, the estate. Let me ask you something before we step inside this place. Have you ever noticed how locations absorb tension? How walls remember arguments? How hallways echo footsteps long after the people are gone? How a home can feel peaceful until it suddenly doesn't? Because the estate wasn't just a backdrop to what happened next. It was a character, a silent witness. A carefully controlled environment that, according to this dramatized reconstruction, played a far bigger role than anyone wanted to admit. From the outside, the property projected permanence. Expansive grounds, gated access, privacy designed to keep the world out. The kind of estate that made outsiders assume security, stability, and order. Nothing chaotic happens here. That assumption would prove dangerously wrong. Inside, the layout mattered. Main house, guest house, separate entrances. Separate lives, close enough to watch each other, far enough to avoid constant contact. On paper, it was practical. In reality, it created distance. Distance that allowed isolation to grow unnoticed. The son lived in the guest house. Not inside the family home. Not fully removed. Close, but not included. Nearby, but not central. Let me ask you this. If you were already feeling sidelined, what would living just outside the main house do to your state of mind? It can feel like independence. It can also feel like exile. According to the narrative, the guest house wasn't chosen for comfort. It was chosen for containment. A way to keep proximity without intimacy. To monitor without engaging. To maintain access while preserving separation. And separation, over time, changes perception. Inside the main house, routines continued. Conversations happened. Decisions were made. Life moved forward. Outside, in the guest house, time slowed. The son was close enough to hear activity, to see lights on, to sense movement, but far enough to feel excluded from it. That kind of proximity breeds unease. You're not alone, but you're not included either. Now layer that with silence. Silence bought with money. Silence enforced by implication. Silence that turns every interaction into performance. Because once the deal existed, nothing could be said openly. Every smile became strategic. Every conversation carefully neutral. Every disagreement swallowed. And swallowed tension doesn't disappear. It accumulates. According to this dramatized account, the estate became a pressure cooker. On the surface, nothing appeared wrong. But underneath, every movement mattered. Who stayed up late? Who avoided eye contact? Who lingered too long in shared spaces? The son noticed these things. He noticed how conversations stopped when he entered rooms. How plans were made without him. How his presence felt tolerated rather than welcomed. Have you ever felt like your existence made other people uncomfortable? That feeling eats at you. And it doesn't take long before you start asking yourself dangerous questions. Am I the problem? Or am I being made into one? According to the reconstruction, subtle narratives began forming inside the family. Nothing explicit, just concerns, comments about mood, remarks about unpredictability, observations framed as worry. He seems off lately. He's been isolating himself. I'm concerned about his state of mind. Concern can be genuine. It can also be a way to plant doubt. And once doubt is planted, it grows fast, especially when fear already exists. Remember, the Silence Pact wasn't just about keeping secrets. It created imbalance. The people who paid held power. The person who received carried risk. That imbalance shaped how every action was interpreted. If the son withdrew, it was seen as suspicious. If he stayed close, it was seen as unsettling. If he spoke, it was seen as threatening. There was no neutral position left. And that's the most dangerous place to be. Meanwhile, the estate's isolation worked both ways. It protected privacy. It also limited perspective. No neighbors close enough to notice changes. No casual visitors to disrupt routines. No outside eyes to dilute internal narratives. Everything that happened stayed inside. And inside stories become self-reinforcing. Now let's talk about the night itself. Not in graphic terms, but in emotional ones. Because tragedy doesn't announce itself with drama. It often arrives quietly. According to the account, the evening began like many others. Routine. Predictable. Unremarkable. No alarms raised. No visible conflict. No signs of escalation. And that's what made what followed so destabilizing. Because when violence occurs without warning, people search backward for meaning. They reconstruct motives. They reinterpret behavior. They connect dots that didn't matter before. And inside this estate, there were plenty of dots to connect. The proximity of the guest house. The pre-existing concerns. The inheritance conflict. The Silence Pact no one spoke about openly. All of it suddenly felt relevant. When authorities arrived, the estate didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a stage. Rooms were examined. Distances measured. Timelines questioned. And proximity became the most obvious factor. Who was closest? Who had access? Who was already perceived as unstable? Suspicion doesn't begin with evidence. It begins with narrative. And the narrative inside this family had already been written. The son lived on the property. The son had conflict. The son had received money. The son had been quiet. Those facts, stripped of context, formed a story. And stories are powerful, especially when reinforced by fear. Here's the part that changes everything. According to this dramatized reconstruction, when the bodies were discovered, the shock was immediate. But it was quickly followed by something else. Direction. A family member reportedly spoke to authorities about concern, about danger, about someone inside the family who should be considered. That statement didn't emerge in a vacuum. It reflected months of internal tension, months of worry, real or constructed, months of positioning. So when suspicion needed a place to land, it landed where it had already been guided. The son. The Silence Pact now worked against him. Because silence can be reframed as guilt. If he denied involvement, it sounded defensive. If he stayed quiet, it looked incriminating. If he referenced the money, it raised more questions. There was no safe response. And remember, the money wasn't documented publicly. There was no clear explanation. So instead of appearing as a protective measure, it could easily be interpreted as motive. Money tied him to the narrative. Isolation sealed it. And the estate, with its controlled access and limited external witnesses, made alternative explanations harder to imagine. This is how environments shape outcomes. The estate didn't cause the tragedy, but it amplified its consequences. It narrowed the field of suspicion. It intensified internal narratives. It made containment possible. Until containment collapsed. Because once authorities began asking questions, silence stopped being an option. And that's when the most dangerous decision of all loomed. Break the pact, or let the narrative consume you. In the next chapter, we'll walk through the discovery itself, not in sensational terms, but in human ones. Who found what? What was said? And how one sentence changed the direction of the investigation forever. Because sometimes, the most powerful moment in a case isn't the crime. It's the first explanation. And what came next would ensure that nothing about this story remained private ever again. The discovery. Let me ask you something before we go any further. When something unthinkable happens, who do you believe first? The person who found it? The person who explains it? Or the story that feels easiest to accept in the moment? Because discovery isn't just about what is found. It's about how meaning rushes in to fill the shock. According to this dramatized reconstruction, the discovery didn't happen in a dramatic burst of chaos. There were no alarms blaring, no crowds, no cinematic panic. It happened quietly, Too quietly. The estate, which had always been insulated from the outside world, was still. Morning light filtered through spaces that had seen countless ordinary days. Nothing in the air warned that the shape. But concern can also guide attention. It can suggest where to look. And in this case, it suggested looking close. Very close. The sun in the guest house. The proximity suddenly mattered. The isolation suddenly mattered. The inheritance conflict suddenly mattered. And the money, the quiet, unexplained money, suddenly mattered more than ever. Investigators began doing what investigators do. They asked questions. Simple ones at first. Who was home? Who had access? Who last spoke to whom? These questions sound neutral. But inside a family already strained by silence and suspicion, they land like accusations. According to the reconstruction, the son was questioned early. Not because of evidence. Because of narrative. Because he was nearby. Because he lived on the property. Because someone had already expressed concern. And because the story needed a shape. Here's something people rarely talk about. In the early hours of an investigation, certainty is scarce. But stories form anyway. And once a story starts forming, it gains momentum fast. The son's behavior, quiet, withdrawn, careful, was suddenly viewed through a different lens. Silence became suspicious. Distance became avoidance. Caution became calculation. And the silence pact? It trapped him. Because he couldn't explain why money had been transferred without revealing the very conflict everyone wanted to keep buried. If he spoke, he would expose the inheritance lie. If he stayed quiet, he looked guilty. It was a no-win position. Let me ask you something. If you were standing in that moment, shocked, confused, suddenly under scrutiny, would you know what to say? Or would every word feel dangerous? According to the dramatized account, the son said very little. Not because he didn't care. Because he was afraid. Afraid that speaking would detonate everything. Afraid that the silence pact would collapse. Afraid that the truth, once released, couldn't be controlled. Meanwhile, the estate filled with unfamiliar energy. Footsteps where there hadn't been any. Questions echoing in rooms that once held routine conversations. Strangers examining spaces that were meant to be private. Privacy evaporated. And with it, the family's ability to manage the narrative. But one narrative had already taken hold. The idea that danger lived inside the family. That it had been building. That someone close was capable of something unthinkable. And once that idea exists, confirmation bias does the rest. Every detail starts to support it. Why was he living separately? Why had there been conflict? Why was there a large transfer of money? Each question layered onto the last, forming a picture that felt increasingly solid, even if it wasn't complete. Here's the part that makes this chapter so difficult. No one had proof yet. No physical answers. No clear sequence. Just fear, suspicion, and fragments of history being stitched together in real time. The son wasn't arrested immediately, but he was marked. And being marked changes how everyone looks at you. The family's grief became complicated. Because grief mixed with suspicion doesn't behave like normal grief. It fractures. Some people retreat. Some people over-explain. Some people talk too much. And some people choose silence, not realizing that silence is no longer neutral. The warning that had been given early on continued to echo. A dangerous family member. That phrase lingered. It hovered over every conversation. It gave investigators a direction. And it gave the family something else. Distance. Distance from the son. Distance from complexity. Distance from their own unresolved role in what had unfolded. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. When tragedy strikes, people look for simplicity. They want a clear villain, a clean narrative, a version of events that allows them to survive emotionally. And complexity threatens that. The silence pact made things complex. The inheritance lie made things complex. The confrontation made things complex. So instead of addressing those layers, the focus narrowed. The son became the center. And as the hours passed, the quiet of the estate transformed into something else. Inevitability. The kind that builds when stories harden into assumptions. The kind that doesn't require certainty. Just momentum. According to the reconstruction, by the end of that day, it was clear. Whatever the truth was, it was no longer unfolding privately. The family no longer controlled the story. And the son, isolated, silent, and already burdened by a deal made months earlier, was now standing at the center of it. But the most important shift hadn't happened yet. Because the discovery didn't just trigger an investigation. It triggered something far more dangerous. A choice. A choice between silence and survival. In the next chapter, we'll walk through what happened after the discovery, the questions that turned sharper, the narrative that solidified, and the moment when suspicion crossed a line and became formal accusation. Because once that line was crossed, the silence pact stopped being protection. It became a trap. And what came next would make walking away impossible: the arrest. Let me ask you a question that feels unfair, but matters more than anything right now. When does suspicion stop being a theory and start becoming a sentence? Because there's a moment in every investigation when uncertainty hardens, when curiosity gives way to certainty, when questions turn into conclusions. And according to this dramatized reconstruction, that moment arrived faster than anyone expected. The hours after the discovery didn't feel like hours. They felt like compression. Everything sped up while understanding lagged behind. Conversations overlapped. Questions repeated. Faces blurred. And the son, already isolated by months of silence and fear, found himself drifting further from the center of human connection and closer to the center of suspicion. Here's what people often misunderstand. Arrests don't always happen because all the evidence is in. Sometimes they happen because the narrative feels complete. And the narrative, in this case, had been forming long before anyone arrived at the estate. From the moment the warning was spoken, the phrase about a dangerous family member, a frame snapped into place. Investigators didn't invent it. They inherited it. And once inherited, it shaped every interaction that followed. The son was cooperative, quiet, careful with words. Those qualities should have helped. Instead, they raised questions. Why so calm? Why so reserved? Why not emotional enough? Grief doesn't follow a script, but suspicion expects one. And when someone doesn't perform grief the way others expect, the gap gets filled with doubt. The questions became more pointed. Where were you that evening? Who did you speak to last? Why was there a financial transfer? The money. It always comes back to the money. The son didn't volunteer the story of the silence pact. He couldn't. To explain the transfer was to expose the inheritance lie, the confrontation, the fear, and to implicate others who still held power. So instead, he answered narrowly, factually, cautiously, and narrow answers, in a charged environment, sound evasive. Let me ask you something. If telling the full truth would destroy multiple lives, would you tell it anyway? Or would you try to survive the moment in front of you? According to the reconstruction, the son chose survival. But survival came at a cost. Because as the questioning continued, the absence of an alternative explanation became its own explanation. Investigators are trained to look for patterns. And the pattern here looked troubling. Conflict, money, proximity, a warning from inside the family. No single element proved anything. Together, they felt compelling. By the end of the first day, the tone had shifted. The questions stopped circling. They started closing in. And the son felt it. You can feel when a room changes. When curiosity turns into certainty. When empathy thins. When people stop asking what happened and start asking why you did it. The arrest didn't come with dramatics. No shouting. No resistance. No last-minute revelations. It came with paperwork. With formal language. With a calm finality that felt unreal. According to this dramatized account, the son was taken into custody not because every question had been answered, but because enough questions pointed in the same direction. He was charged. And with that, the story hardened. Headlines don't carry nuance. They carry certainty. Once the arrest happened, everything before it was reinterpreted through that lens. The inheritance dispute wasn't a family conflict anymore. It was motive. The silence pact wasn't damage control anymore. It was payoff. The isolation wasn't emotional withdrawal anymore. It was suspicious behavior. And the warning given early on? It was treated as foresight. Here's the part that hurts to consider. Once an arrest is made, innocence becomes theoretical. Publicly, the story is already written. And privately, the family fractures further. Some members leaned into the narrative. Some retreated from it. Some avoided speaking altogether. And one person did something unexpected. He broke ranks. Because while the arrest simplified the story for the outside world, it complicated things inside the family. The brother who would later speak out, the one we'll hear from soon, didn't see closure. He saw something else. A pattern repeating. The inheritance lie, the confrontation, the money, the silence, and now the arrest. It looked less like justice to him and more like inevitability, like a plan reaching its final stage. Think about that for a moment. If someone believed that a silence pact included an unspoken understanding, that one person would take the fall if things went wrong, wouldn't this moment look terrifyingly familiar? The son, now in custody, faced a decision he never thought he'd have to make. Continue protecting the pact or protect himself? Because once arrested, silence stops being neutral. It becomes self-destruction. And yet, speaking now would mean exposing everything. The inheritance lie, the confrontation that triggered panic, the money that bought silence, and the people who benefited from it. Let me ask you something. Would you trust that the truth would save you? Or would you fear it would only deepen the damage? That fear is where this chapter ends. Because while the arrest felt like an ending to the outside world, it was only the beginning of a much darker phase. In the next chapter, we'll hear about the voice that refused to stay quiet. The brother who believed the arrest wasn't the end of the story, but proof that the silence pact had done exactly what it was designed to do. And once he started talking, everything changed. Because what came next wasn't just an accusation. It was an exposure. Jake breaks the silence. Let me ask you a question that cuts straight to the bone. What would it take for you to turn against your own blood? Not argue, not distance yourself, but stand up and say, this story is wrong. Because breaking silence inside a family like this isn't bravery in the abstract. It's a demolition. It means accepting that relationships will never be repaired, that loyalty will be questioned, that motives will be attacked, and that once the words leave your mouth, you can't pull them back. According to this dramatized reconstruction, Jake didn't plan to speak. Not at first. In the days following the arrest, he stayed quiet like everyone else. He watched the narrative harden. He read the headlines. He listened to the same simplified version of events repeat itself over and over again. And with every repetition, something inside him tightened. Because the story being told didn't just leave things out. It erased them. The inheritance dispute vanished. The confrontation disappeared. The money became a footnote, stripped of context. The silence pact ceased to exist. Everything was flattened into a single idea. One bad person, one bad night, one inevitable outcome. And Jake couldn't reconcile that with what he knew. Let me be clear here. According to this account, Jake wasn't defending the act. He was questioning the path that led there. Because to him, the arrest didn't feel like resolution. It felt like the final step of a process that had started long before anyone died. A process driven by fear. A process fueled by secrecy. A process that needed a single point of collapse. And the more he thought about it, the more one detail haunted him. The money. $50 million doesn't appear in a story by accident. It doesn't move without purpose. It doesn't sit unexplained unless someone wants it to. Jake began asking the questions everyone else avoided. Why was the transfer made so quickly after the confrontation? Why was there no clear explanation offered publicly? Why did silence seem more valuable than clarity? And most importantly, why did everything fall apart exactly the way the silence pact would have predicted? Because according to what Jake would later allege, the deal wasn't just about keeping someone quiet. It was about preparing for disaster. Preparing for a moment when blame would be needed. Think about that. If you believe that something could go wrong, not might, but could, wouldn't you want insulation? Wouldn't you want someone positioned to absorb the fallout? That idea terrified him. Not because it proved anything definitively, but because it explained too much. It explained why concern about danger had been voiced so early. It explained why suspicion narrowed so fast. It explained why silence had been enforced so aggressively. Jake began to feel like he was watching a script play out. And scripts don't write themselves. At first, he tried to raise concerns privately. Quiet conversations, careful phrasing, questions framed as confusion rather than accusation. But those conversations went nowhere. Defensiveness met curiosity. Dismissal met concern. And the same message surfaced repeatedly. Don't complicate things. That phrase can sound practical. It can also sound like control. And control, once recognized, is impossible to ignore. Jake realized something critical in those early days. The silence pact hadn't just bound one person. It had bound everyone. Because as long as no one acknowledged it, the narrative remained clean. But the second it was acknowledged, everything would unravel. And that's when Jake faced his own choice. stay quiet, and watch the story solidify into something he believed was incomplete, or speak and shatter the family entirely. Let me ask you something. If you believed someone was being sacrificed to preserve an image, could you live with your silence? Jake couldn't. According to this dramatized reconstruction, the moment he decided to speak wasn't dramatic. It wasn't impulsive. It was heavy. It came after sleepless nights, after replaying conversations, after realizing that silence was no longer neutral. Because once an arrest happens, silence stops being protection. It becomes participation. Jake didn't go public immediately. He started by telling the story in fragments. To investigators, to legal counsel, to anyone who would listen without judgment. He spoke about the inheritance dispute, the confrontation, the fear that followed, and then, finally, the money, not as a bribe in the crude sense, but as a tool, a way to freeze a problem in place. According to Jake's account, the pact wasn't written down. It didn't need to be. It lived in implication, in tone, in expectation, silence in exchange for security, and security in exchange for loyalty. But loyalty, as Jake saw it, had turned into a weapon, because when tragedy struck, loyalty was weaponized to isolate one person. And isolation, when combined with fear, becomes accusation. Jake didn't claim to know everything. That's important. He didn't pretend to have answers to questions that didn't belong to him. What he claimed was something simpler and more explosive. That the story being told left out the conditions that made everything possible. That without understanding the inheritance lie, the confrontation, and the silence pact, the arrest made no sense. And that the silence pact itself created the very outcome it was meant to prevent. Those claims didn't land softly. They weren't welcomed. They were treated as betrayal. Because breaking silence doesn't just threaten individuals. It threatens systems. And the family system, built on control, image, and quiet management, couldn't survive exposure. Jake was warned. Not explicitly, but emotionally. He was told to be careful, told not to speculate, told not to make things worse. But to Jake, things were already worse. Someone was in custody. A family was destroyed. And the truth, whatever it was being suffocated. So he kept talking. And with every word, the stakes rose. Because once the silence pact entered the conversation, everything else had to be re-examined. The money wasn't neutral anymore. The warning wasn't instinct anymore. The arrest wasn't inevitable anymore. It became a question, a terrifying one. What if this wasn't just a crime followed by consequences? What if it was the final movement in a story written months earlier? Jake didn't accuse lightly, but he accused clearly. And clarity is dangerous. Because clarity doesn't allow people to hide behind confusion. The family response was swift. Distance. Silence. Walls where doors used to be. Jake had crossed a line. And once crossed, there was no returning. But something else happened too. The narrative cracked. The silence pact. Let me ask you a question that sounds hypothetical, until it isn't. What does silence actually cost? Not the kind of silence that comes from grief. Not the kind that comes from shock. But the kind that's negotiated. Purchased. Maintained. Because silence, when it's chosen, isn't empty. It's structured. According to this dramatized reconstruction, the silence pact didn't arrive fully formed. It evolved. It grew out of fear, urgency, and the belief that problems could be managed if they were contained tightly enough. That's how these things always begin. Not with villainy. With pragmatism. After the confrontation, the one that exposed the inheritance lie, the family didn't immediately think in terms of consequences. They thought in terms of damage control. How do we keep this from spreading? How do we make sure nothing leaks? How do we stabilize the situation without admitting fault? Those questions aren't criminal on their own. They're human. But when money enters the equation, the questions change. They stop being about resolution. They start being about leverage. The silence pact, as Jake later described it, wasn't introduced as an ultimatum. It wasn't framed as a threat. It was presented as a solution. A way forward. A reset. A chance to put the confrontation behind everyone and return to normal. Normal is a seductive word. It promises safety. It promises familiarity. It promises relief. And when people are desperate, they cling to it. According to this account, the conversation around the pact was careful, deliberate, almost gentle. No raised voices. No explicit warnings. Just implication layered on implication. This will help you. This will ease the tension. This will protect the family. And there it was. The word that justified everything. Protection. But protection for whom? That question was never answered directly. Because the pact didn't specify outcomes. It specified expectations. Silence.